I actually saw you. I go to that John Varvatos show at the Beacon, the Love Rocks.
Oh, Love Rocks, yeah.
Yeah, and you come out every year, the last 2 years, and have just murdered it.
Thank you.
It's really rad, dude. And so when Emily told me that you were going to be the guest for this, I was like, oh, this is perfect. And so we're doing a special one now. We're at the Melrose Podcast Studios, but I have, because of the short amount of time, I just was like, Morty was going to come watch. He writes the show for me, and I was like, let's just do a whole little powwow because here's my deal. Like with T.Rex, I've only recently gotten into him because of the movie Longlegs. Have you watched that?
Yes, I did, specifically for the soundtrack.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he's all over Longlegs, and
they don't give Billy Elliot credit.
But I am such a huge fan of that movie, and which then got me digging into more of T-Rex's music, and of course I knew like Get It On.
Sure.
And, but it's like to really finally dig into this record. So what brings you here though? Because I mean I can kind of see it. Like you're a rock star when I seen you perform, but also just getting your vibe as well. So it almost feels like it's so like you guys gel perfectly. But so how did you get into T-Rex?
Well, I think when I was sort of like on a self-discovery mission of all things that were considered like UK based, like glam, so to speak. I grew up in like a Christian household. My dad's like a gospel singer, songwriter and whatnot. And the truth be told, there just wasn't a lot of popular music like laying around the house as a kid, you know. And one thing that I've sort of learned after speaking with loads of different people over the years is that you either self-discover this stuff or it's your parents that introduce you to these kind of things. I discovered like Queen and Zeppelin, AC/DC, all of those kind of like acts.
Which are still old by the time you got into them.
Of
they
course.
were all out and most of the guys were dead. I mean, that had died. I mean, that was like, you know, because you got to be late 30s, early 30s?
Mid 30s.
Mid 30s. I don't want to age you.
It's
but
all right,
I'm
man.
saying is like I look back and I'm like, oh, mid 30s. And then I go, oh my God, and I look at the date.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
Duran had already broken up.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I look. Sorry, go on.
No, it's fine. And then, you know, I was one of the sort of like kids that sort of discovered those bands and it became like my own kind of thing because it wasn't around, you know, they weren't groups that typically you could go and see. And I was just fascinated with all of that rock and roll kind of bygone era stuff and found a huge amount of inspiration within it. And the glam thing I really started getting into a couple of years after that. And of course, like when you're sort of really digging into like the glam category in the United Kingdom and all its history, you're gonna come across T.Rex and of course like Bowie and whatnot and all of the other groups that capitalized on and fetishized on what mainly Mark, and we'll probably get onto it, mainly Mark and David Bowie sort of really were the archetypes for, you know. So that's kind of why I'm here.
I love that. You want me to catch you up real quick?
Yeah, because I thought so you're saying that we talked about this earlier. You're saying that Bowie was one way, and then he heard T-Rex, and then Bowie was another way.
So let's put this into perspective. 1947, England. Mark Feld is born. Nice Jewish kid from England. He becomes a musician. He's in a band called John's Children. They have a middling hit, a mod sort of band, but he's got his eye on it. He is very much a go-getter. I think his frailties in that department sort of becomes arrogance, and he starts saying, "I'm going to be this, you know, character." So he puts together. Now we're getting to the '60s, late '60s. He puts together a duo, him and a percussion player named Steve Peregrine Took. And it's exactly what you imagine it to be. He's sitting, you know, with his legs crossed on a carpet, on a rug, and there's a guy next to him banging on bongos, and he's playing an acoustic guitar. And the songs are, if Lenny Kravitz read Tolkien, like that. They're the imagery
And the demons fly, and
very much,
and the meadows
and people
flow.
Yeah, because remember it's late '60s, so there's the psychedelia that's spilling over, and then it becomes this sort of thing, and then. He gets, so there's a guy named Tony Visconti, a producer.
We know about him.
And Tony worked for Denny Cordell, and he was like an assistant, and he's like, hey, why don't you produce? And he goes, okay. And I went out, and he was in England at the time. He's a New York guy, and he sees this band, which is 2 guys, and he's like, wow, this is fantastic. But he's not really a producer, but he goes in the studio, and over the course of like 4 albums, they go from being, the first one is like the title is ridiculously long. It's we're gonna do what we want to do. We're gonna record this way, and we're gonna 15 songs. Doesn't really do anything. Another one comes out, doesn't really do anything. Third record, now his management team, he becomes involved with a woman who works at his management team, and then the management goes, well, why don't you pick up an electric guitar? Like, you're doing this acoustic thing, it's kind of run its course, and he starts going out with this woman, and then he basically axes and goes like, I can't believe you asked me to pick up an electric guitar. I'm out of here. Bounces from there, becomes his wife June. They move on. Tony Visconti's still producing. They end up doing a record prior to this one. Now he's putting together, now his idea is I'm going to be electric. Mm-hmm. But he still hasn't gotten rid of the percussionist. So there's no drums. It's this weird sound of this, boogie, which you would call, English people would say boogie. Here it would be boogie.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit different, but it's very much rooted in Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, Chuck Berry, kind of like what AC/DC does in that way, but very sparse, very open. So by the time we get to this record, he does the first, I'm trying to make this as tight as possible. Basically, Tony Visconti is tired of writing Tyrannosaurus Rex. In the thing, calendar today, I have Tyrannosaurus, and he just goes T.Rex, and he writes it in his calendar, and Mark sees it, because it's not Mark's idea.
I think Tyrannosaurus and the word restaurant are the 2 hardest words to write.
Yeah, and one comes up a lot more.
I don't think any one of us could write restaurant perfectly
The
first time. There's no way.
Yeah, it's just, the AU, is AU there or there? And then he does, he writes T-Rex, Mark says it and goes, I don't like that. And then a short while later, when it's Mark's idea, he goes, okay, I like that. And he's like, I want a band. I'm tired of doing this thing. He does the first record. There's a lot of lectures. They put out a single.
Yeah.
Ride a White Swan comes out. And if you know the single, it's groovy. And then he does like Hot Love. But there's still not a rock band. There's no drums. It's all the percussive elements. So imagine at this time he goes from being there goes Sid Barrett, very Sid Barrett influenced, to being like Cat Stevens influenced.
Oh, wow.
Now, where Cat Stevens stays in the folk thing into the 70s, he decides, I want some of that. I want the Les Paul. I want the stack. So by the time we get to the record before this and then into this, he puts together a band. He gets a drummer, which is now, he's gotten rid of Peregrine Took, the percussionist, and now he gets Mickey Finn, because Mickey Finn's more of a laugh, more fun, better hang.
Better looking as well.
Yeah, and he's cute and good looking, and Mark knows how to pitch. People have said, disparagingly, but with some awe, he was incredibly arrogant, incredibly egotistical. But
Bolan.
It was covering up. And by the way, he went from Feld to Bolan because he took the first half of Bob Dylan and the second half of Bob Dylan, Bo-Lin.
Yeah, you said that.
And that became his stage name. It became this thing. They become T.Rex. They do the record, which sort of brings us up. They come to America while they're touring this first album. In England, they become hugely popular.
Yeah, it's like, I was going to wonder, is like all the contemporaries of the guys that you play with, is everybody, like, were the Oasis guys? Are they're huge T-Rex fans? Like,
Cigarettes and alcohol is blatant.
Is Get It On, essentially. I mean, going back to Ride a White Swan, though, like, I mean, let's not forget that was such a huge hit in the UK at the time, and what was really interesting about it is it was a fusion between all of the stuff that he'd been doing before when he was on his little cushion, and he had these whimsical, poetic kind of lyrics, and that was the first sort of like song, which was a small preview of like this sound, which was going to be, well, which would lead to T.Rex to see in the United Kingdom, and that was distorted boogie woogie guitars and Tony adding the string element, which had never really been done before, which gave it sort of like an aura of like more English Sgt. Pepper-esque sophistication. And then that marrying with Mark's use of language, which I really think gets really overlooked when you think about when you hear one of his lyrics or you simply read it. He's one of those very few artists that you read the first couple of stanzas and you're like, that's a Mark Bolan song.
Oh, yeah.
You just know it.
And you know how to write. Once you learn that a bit,
it's
you
so
can
easy
do
to
the
parody
sort
it.
of, you know. And you're, as you were saying, the Tony Visconti sound. Tony's learning like he is. He becomes their George Martin, but he's learning as he goes, and that's the idea. It's like, oh, we had strings and this hard guitar and this other thing, but we still keep it relatively sparse. There's a lot of air on these records. And so what happens is they blow up the T.Rex, which Luke was speaking of. They blow up in England, and now they're selling out everywhere, but they can't break America. You know, there is no media. And by the way, so these singles, which prior he had a single called Deborah, which didn't, you know, much to his chagrin, didn't break, but it became, you know, sort of underground popular, and he became an underground hippie sort of hero. So as he goes to this, there was like the Bob Dylan parallel going electric,
which he loved, by the way.
Which
he absolutely adored. The fact, like, when he, like, as you said, when he was starting off with those first couple of albums where it was this acoustic thing, and there was like a radio DJ called John Peel who absolutely adored him. And even more so, I was even watching an interview with Mick Jagger just yesterday, where even he said that he preferred like Mark and T.Rex when it was Tyrannosaurus Rex and it was all this kind of acoustic thing. And maybe it's a bit of jealousy, and maybe it's that kind of thing that happens when something that you hold dear to yourself and you feel like you have a bit of ownership and it gets commercialized. But I mean, going back to the Bob Dylan comparison, Mark absolutely loved the fact that they hated
when he went electric.
Because it was exactly what Dylan had gone through, you know, and I think he really just sort of like held on to that.
Yeah, it was his idea, because it was management's idea, he hated it. And then when it was his idea, fucking loved it. He became, you know what I'm gonna do, man? I'm gonna get a Les Paul guitar. But the band doesn't change. So you got to imagine now he's making racket. And by the way, also Mark's this tall. He's a tiny
boy. He's a little boy.
He grows his hair out and he's corkscrew. I mean, it's always used corkscrew, but in, you know, the Jufro, but like grown out, big, thump, thump, thump. And
2 Jufro artists in a row.
Yeah.
We had Paul Stanley and Kiss.
And we're 2 Jews,
so we had the Gene Simmons.
It's not like we're being
We had the big
disparaging.
bushy, dude.
I always admire. I have it on the chest, but I always admired, like, you could do that and he would just do this, and he became like this, you know, he became this totem. And he goes, so remember, when he's doing these acoustic-y kind of things, his management company is like, well, how do we get you? You're doing Isle of Wight, and you're doing this. And also, he's sitting on the floor on a rug with a dude next to him. Nobody can see past the first 2 rows. You're just sort of hearing a guy, and he's out of sight line. So they're like, you know, can you maybe...
Was he playing like clubs, or is he playing like is this arenas at this point?
He's doing festivals at this point.
Oh, yeah,
He's doing like Isle of Wight, but the other people on the bill would be like the Jimi Hendrixes.
Sure.
And like the Doors, whatever. So you got to imagine also, there's a movie called Velvet Goldmine, which I adore. If you ever saw it. I actually saw it right up the street. And it's a story of Bowie, but he mixes a lot of like Mark's story and everything in it. It's just a fun movie, great soundtrack. Michael Stipe co-produced it. But in this, they sort of have that where nobody's really getting it. You know, like Angie Bowie, June is like sitting there adoringly looking at him, but the audience is sort of like, what do we do with this? And as the 60s start going into the 70s. So he comes after this huge thing. They sort of come through America, but they can't really play huge places. There's no relevance to this band.
Yeah.
But they're kind of coming through. So in London, this record starts in London, New York, and a lot at Wally Heider in Los Angeles. So this is a very Los Angeles record. Bowie sort of does the same thing by the time he gets to Aladdin Sane, where he basically names each like city on each title track of it. So where we end up here, this record comes out. It has his only, and it's all in the actual songs as we go through it, but he has his really only hits in America based on this. If you're not British or you're not aware of it, he was a footnote, because Bowie went from Anthony Newley and sort of this British, to Syd Barrett, the Laughing Gnome and all that.
Yeah.
And then he starts seeing, and he goes from Hunky Dory, which is very Velvet Underground, very acoustic, which, by the way, like the best David Bowie album. I mean, it's gorgeous and it's everything. But before America gets Hunky Dory, he becomes Ziggy Stardust. In no small part.
And like you said, so Ziggy Stardust is because of this guy.
I mean, you could...
Yeah, there's no doubt that you would have never had Ziggy without Mark.
Yeah, and Mark's first one on television is wearing glitter, and he's wearing eyeliner, and he's wearing a feather boa, and he's a dandy.
Yeah,
which is
a dandy boy,
and
a foppy
similar
fop.
to dandy, he is openly quasi-sexual, and Bowie.
Well, aren't
does
they
that
all
later.
kind of in back in the day?
I don't know that
I
they
feel like
actually
everybody's
were, but he said it. There's one thing just to be it. Like when Elton John finally came out some years later, but this class of 71 is exactly what you think of. It's like Elton John, and then David Bowie crossing over into Ziggy, and then T.Rex, and then Slade, and then there's all of this glam rock thing happens, which is the precursor to punk rock.
Yeah.
And so now we leave the 60s behind, but we bring a lot of the 50s, which is that boogie and that Chuck Berry riffs, and the Eddie Cochran, chinka, 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 the Bo Diddley, everything that we've talked about for years on this podcast, it's all built on it. And Mark has a moment in time. He has a moment in time with Electric Warrior, and it is as influential for British people. Steve Jones will talk about it from Sex Pistols. Everybody was like, wow. And then Roxy Music.
Sure,
yes. Well, and like you mentioned, like Oasis as well.
Yeah.
One of the... On Morning Glory, I remember reading an interview with Noel Gallagher, and he's a huge T.Rex fan, and praises those records. And one technique that Mark and Tony and the band used to do, which was really unique, is they wouldn't start the recording of a song like with a with the drums and bass guitar and then build on that. They would literally have Mark with his acoustic guitar in his own time and tempo, and then they would build on top of this guide track, which would then create this sort of like moving song which fluctuates a little bit, but
no
just
clicks,
no clicks.
All
so
feel.
It's all based on Mark's original feel, which I find really interesting, because there is a difference between when you're writing a song and you're playing it acoustically without a click, and when it gets to a certain section, you might sort of fluctuate ever so slightly, or like put emphasis.
Exciting. Yeah, throw your shoulder in it.
And I know that when Oasis were recording Morning Glory, that second album, they tried it, but they only did it for one song, Roll With It.
Oh, right on.
Which, once I heard and read, I listened to the whole record, and I'm like, actually, that particular song does have a very unique feel compared to the rest of the songs on that album, and it's because they obviously adopted that recording technique, which I thought was fascinating.
That's why they lost the Britpop Wars to Blur.
To Blur.
Well, no.
I'm kidding. I'm joking.
Oasis definitely won that war.
Yeah.
In the end,
ultimately. But I would say, well, you're going. I'm
going to see them
Oasis.
I'm going with a bunch of like British comics. I'm going with Jim Jeffries, Jimmy Carr. We're going to see him at Wembley. So let's do the opening track, Mambo Sun. This really showcases the musical interplay between the bluesy boogie guitar percussion elements that define so much of this record and T.Rex in general. Do you have thoughts on this, or what do you think when you hear the opening track to this record?
I couldn't agree more. I think it's one of those. It is like many songs on this album. There are sort of signature tunes that you just sort of hear and heavily associate with the image, and you know, throughout the years, with a lot of these songs being placed in films and whatnot, they sort of harken back to a very specific time in the United Kingdom, which wasn't going through a very good place at that time, and there were strikes happening everywhere. Things were being closed down. The working class were really struggling, and it has now all of this imagery attached to it, which is always a great sign of timeless art. But again, this particular song does have everything that you would expect from like a typical T.Rex track, and that is the percussion elements. It's the sultry, poetic, like vocal delivery. It's a really like sexy groove as well.
Yeah.
You know, I've met a lot of girls over the years who love T.Rex, but specifically
This song.
adore this one song. And I'm like, yeah, it's cool. It's cool.
Yeah.
But there's something about it that, you know, like
Sorry.
they're definitely drawn to.
And it pulls you in. I mean, it doesn't open the record where most people conventionally would think Electric Warrior
it's a really
would open with like Get It On.
Yeah.
And it goes, and by the way, DJing it is difficult because it's not an even four at the front. It's just, and he just pops right in, and you're like, fuck, just give me another 4 count so I can set up coming out of something or going into it. But it does, like, I think if you were a T.Rex or a Tyrannosaurus Rex fan, there's already a record and singles in between. This immediately goes, it makes you do this when you're listening to it, which is impressive on a record that is, he's on the cover holding a guitar in front of a stack. The first thing you would think he would come out of the
why do you think he would open with this song if you know we're expecting so much, like you said, if it's called Electric Warrior, like what?
Good question. I personally think it was a conscious attempt to take his hardcore fans that loved the acoustic, whimsical stuff and just gently introduce them into this sort of like new transition that he was going into, because there are some like quote, well, in today's standards, not heavy, but there are some heavy hitting songs on this album, and I don't know, I personally think it was a gentle introduction of what's to come. So when they put on the vinyl, they're like, oh, okay, this is a bit different, but it's still the Mark and band that I know and I love and I've invested in emotionally.
How do you guys figure out on your records, like what you're going to open with? Because I always thought, you know, we talked about it, like I think doing a mixtape for a girl, because I've never made a record, but it's like you come up boom with the banger, then you bring it down, and then you build it back up. You know, how, like when you're thinking of opening, you know, a record, like how do you guys decide?
It really depends. I mean, with the band, I'll try and go with something that really grabs you straight away. But like, for instance, with my solo album that just came out a few days ago, I went the complete opposite. And there were a couple of songs like this album that do have massive crescendos and hard hitting drums and whatnot. But I decided to open the whole thing with essentially a piano ballad kind of thing, which has a bit of a crescendo at the end. But I wanted the listener to be like, woo, and draw themselves in and be like, what is this? This was not what I was expecting. So it really depends on the project.
Yeah.
And I guess what your audience is and the message you also want to convey, you know?
And because you have such power in your voice, it's also nice to sort of begin with a dynamic shift to sort of go, because you know I've been a singer for years. You sing, it's that same thing where you're like, I know you, but let me show you, let me show you what I'm capable of now before you go, oh, that screamer sure can croon.
Yeah,
it's nice to be able to introduce something like that too, and be like, remember, at the core, I'm still a singer.
And I think going back to this track, I think that's what he was trying to do, is like ease everyone into this like kind of new and exciting sound, and like you said earlier, like the other big moments that he had before this record, it didn't have the drums and it didn't have the bass. And by the way, the rhythm section from this album onwards and the one that he toured with, like, untouchable.
Bill Legend and Steve, I blanked on Steve's last name, But Tony Visconti played for a minute because then he ended up being in the hype
Yeah.
with Bowie. But yeah, no, the rhythm section on this, and that's the thing too. They got on great, and they gave it exactly what it needed.
So well.
You know,
yeah.
it's just, and they locked, and Bill's drum style, Bill Legend, I believe, Bill's drum style was like Ringo.
Yeah.
He did these tom-filled things that
Yeah.
wasn't like, you know, even John Bonham was it was like, like, it gave us so much space and was like, it laid back. It never got uptight on those tracks, which gives it, with, you know, Mickey still banging away, it gives it that space. Ow.
I think that's why,
Yeah.
like, you talk about Ringo, and like in the movie in Born to Boogie, when you've got Ringo and the drummer both playing with each other, it's like, have you seen that?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
They're doing, I believe it is Tutti Frutti, the Little Richard song.
Yeah, love that
And you've
stuff.
got Ringo and Mark's drummer, both with kind of similar styles, drumming in unison, which was a huge thing and
And
massive.
Harry Nilsson started doing it with Richard Perry and all those John Lennon,
Well,
the Pussycats.
and Gary
Yeah,
Glitter as well, the Glitter
exactly.
Band. Like everyone started doing stuff and recording tracks with two drummers simultaneously playing, which became like the bedrock for what would be like the sound.
So it was a
of
wall
UK.
of sound
Yeah.
live. You know, and they could, I mean, when you see Ringo and Keltner or any of those guys, and they just, you know, listen to Pussycats too. The record, the Harry Nilsson record John Lennon produced. It's a cocaine festival.
Oh, I need to hear.
Love a
that.
And it
cocaine
destroyed-
festival.
Oh, when
Love
John was
music
here
on
for the May
cocaine.
Pang Lost Weekend,
Right.
he recorded this record, and there's covers on it of Subterranean Homesick Blues.
Really?
Oh, it's, if you've never heard it.
Wow.
And here we go. Like, it's just, and it's like this thing. What you expect? Keith Moon, the Hollywood Vampires.
Yeah.
Keith Moon and this guy, but with John Lennon and them screaming over. And this is where, like, Harry lost a lot of his high end of his voice. They screamed till they were spitting blood in a bucket of like trying to outdo each other. Lennon and him, cocaine, whiskey or whatever, brandy.
Have you ever gotten into that kind of when you're, because I've seen you on stage doing the Beacon, and I mean, and singing, you have such a great voice, and I think singers, we kind of have that. We just, you know, when I was jamming with Jelly Roll the other night, we're doing "How You Remind Me," which is not a fucking, we're doing a Nickelback song. It's not, it's not fucking.
This interview's over.
Yeah, it's not, but you know, all due respect, it's a great song. The crowd went
Chad's
crazy.
a great writer, man.
It's
Like,
a
there's no-
generational thing. I don't get it. It's exactly where it needs to be. for you.
But you can see that we're vibing. Or you're going to go for that. No, you go for that. Are there other singers? Like, is there another singer from another band that you have like a little unspoken competition with?
It's tough because we're kind of a bit out there on our own in terms of like genre and whatnot. And honestly, I don't. The only person I'm in competition with is mainly myself.
Sure.
If that, not
Yeah,
to
yeah,
sound
makes perfect
corny.
sense.
no,
yeah.
no,
But
yeah.
it's true. But to try and answer your question, I think that there's been very few people that I've sort of seen, and not in a super cocky way, but where I'm sort of like, I could do that, or I could do that, but I could do that even better. But I remember when I met Steven Tyler for the first time, and I spent some time with him in Maui, and he was recording some music, and this would have been about 9 years ago, and I couldn't believe like the control he had and the range that he still had. At
I
his
mean, now
age.
it's harder. Yeah, but yeah.
But like, even, I mean, 8 years ago when I
Yeah.
was watching him, he would get up, and there was a couple of times I saw him perform, and he did Dream On, and you know, at the very end where he slips into that
yeah.
head slash chest voice.
That's hard.
Not only is it extremely difficult, and I think you genuinely have to be like genetically gifted
Yeah, you have to be him.
to do that.
Yeah.
But like I said, the control and like the precision and the pitch, I was genuinely like floored, and I definitely think he's one of the absolute greats. And yeah, I mean, I also admire singers that have completely different voices from my own, like like Scott Walker, and these
Yeah.
sort of really beautiful, silky, deep crooners. Because I'll never be able to have that, you know, and that control of like the vibrato, which to some people kind of sounds a bit corny, but there's a certain level of technique which I also admire, and I know is kind of unreachable, but just because of like the way that I'm built, you know, physically. So
Imagine Scott Walker. Well, you have the sort of the look with the sunglasses today too, but Scott Walker. They were American guys who went to England and blew up there. And the song "The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore" is probably the most known song by them.
Yeah.
But he was like a crooner. But he almost was like a proto-goth in
Yeah.
his entire. And then he became incredibly out there. But those records are like these almost like not power ballads. Emptiness. It has a certain and Brian Ferry too. You can hear a lot of people that came after.
the Jacques Brel covers,
Yeah.
of like that were translated into English, that he sort of, I'm pretty sure for his first 4 albums he put maybe 1 or 2 of them in every record
Michel
that he did.
Legrand sort of stuff that is just, I mean,
It was a
gorgeous.
lot of old French music, or Belgium, whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it. And then it was really unique because he's obviously American, but to look at him, to listen to him, you're like, oh, this is
I never knew he
definitely
wasn't.
a British.
I thought he was British.
Oh, yeah,
Because
yeah,
he
yeah.
only blew up. It was like when the Strokes got fed back to us, or Terence Trent D'Arby. All of a sudden we were like, oh, there's this new, even Jimi Hendrix when he came back, people just assumed he was
He's British.
English.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like
Because
the Killers
he-
were
yeah.
probably the most.
Yeah, they all
recent.
broke there,
Yeah, yeah.
came here, and I'm reading British magazines going like, oh, I got to get this new record. And then I'm like, they're from Vegas?
Yeah.
I was like, shit, I could have gone 3 hours and seen them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
So, all right, so we only have a little bit more time. What are the main other songs?
I would, the next, well,
So Cosmic Dancer.
Cosmic,
Yeah.
I mean,
Cosmic Dancer.
this is Template.
And
this is like
speaking of
blueprint.
movies,
yeah.
you know, I mean, the opening scene for the movie Billy Elliot.
Yeah.
That's, I think, gosh, I was quite young when that came out, but I do remember very clearly the scene of Billy sort of jumping in slow-mo with this song playing in the background, and that almost encapsulates all of the emotion and the feel of this song. It's really magic.
Yeah.
It's really magic. And the drumming on this as well is just brilliant towards the end.
All that,
on that
it's
outro.
very much like the Day in the Life, that sort of
Yeah.
spacey. I mean, you see what's there?
Do we read it?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And
so
by the
this-
way, if you want to know the lasting impact of this song, 1991 at the Forum in Los Angeles, Morrissey covers this. Who comes out and does the duet with him? David Bowie.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a
Really?
recording of it.
Have you heard Nick Cave do this?
No, but it makes absolute
It's
sense.
really
like it makes absolute. Scott Walker would have done a great.
Oh yeah, yeah. Of course.
I was dancing. Brian
I was
Ferry too.
dancing.
Yeah.
So never a single, but even as album track, it remains beloved, endearing to the T.Rex fans. It's about reincarnation and living a full life, and got both of these when it was featured as the opening song to the wonderful 2001 film Billy Elliot, about a poor English boy who aspired to become a dancer despite his father's initial reluctance. Damn, I've never seen Billy Elliot.
You never seen it?
No.
Now
really-
it was
it is
originally
really
a
I
play.
keep watching Aliens,
It was
dude.
a play, and then it was a
What?
movie, and then it was a musical. Elton John ended up doing the music for another acolyte. I mean, another T.Rex contemporary and fan, and then he ended up doing the music for the musical. But like Longlegs, it's a pretty much a big T-Rex.
So there's all.
soundtrack.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's because it's of its time. It's supposed to be contemporary to that.
So let's take it. So Jeepster, thoughts on that? What do you?
What's your question? Were you really a dancer, or was that really a thing, or is that just sort of in the bio of like wanting to?
When I was younger, that was my first love and passion.
I love that.
I wanted to essentially join a ballet school and everything, and do that whole business. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Something talked you out of it, or was it just?
Yeah, I think it was a reality of, if I was to have gone, it would have been like a boarding school
Gotcha.
and all this kind of stuff. And I don't think my parents wanted someone else bringing me up.
Gotcha.
And you know what? Like, it's totally fine. In fact, one of my cousins ended up taking on that going down that path and joining the Royal Ballet. And
I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Wow, that's as prestigious as you can get.
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think Billy Elliot. I mean, I don't want to
Yeah, I
blow
think-
any of it.
Yeah, I think he ends up in the London Royal one. And
Yeah, I don't want to like spoiler alert. He's a dancer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But no, it's a great film.
Yeah,
great film.
you'll love it. It's a classic. And I saw it. I was married to a British woman at the time when I saw it, and it was just one of those.
But what do you think of Jeepster then?
Hit it.
Oh, I love it. Jeepster, Mark has acknowledged that he based this on a Howlin' World song.
Helen Wolf.
You had World.
It recorrected me and
Howlin' Wolf song written by Willie Dixon called "You'll Be Mine." And besides lifting ideas from old blues records like the Stones and Led Zeppelin, this also utilizes the long-standing tradition of using a car as a metaphor for a sex object or act. Yeah, great song. Thoughts?
I mean, this is
This is
the boogiest. This is the first epic boogie on this record, and it's just. I mean, it's that. I could just do that rhythm to somebody if I just went stomp, 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 bump, bump, bump. You just go, oh fuck, it's Jeepster, and then it became "Lay Down Sally" for Eric Clapton, and it's. I mean, this to me is a better song than "Get It On." But it's well, because I love "Get It On," but
Get It On
I
is so
hear "Get It"
great.
after I've heard it a couple times. Like with Jeepster, it still has that.
Look, controversial opinion. I love Jeepster. Sonically, it does not sound as good as Get It On. In my opinion.
No, I agree.
I love the use of the language. I mean, what I find really interesting about this song in particular, I've seen footage of it live. I mean, can you imagine what the mum and dads would have thought of with the line like, "I'm a vampire for your love and I'm gonna suck it," and the way that he says it,
As lascivious as he can.
so you're going from the worried parents who had to deal with the Rolling Stones and the Beatles with Satisfaction, etc., all this rebellion, and then with Mark, it's like hypersexualized, and the way that he sings and his like body language, it took all of that like to a completely different new level, which the younger generation of the United Kingdom hadn't seen, all too well. So
it's a knockout. And then if you can, like I was saying, one thing I noticed about it is because of all the acoustic-y kind of, it doesn't have a clean sound like Get It On. Get It On is jink, can, jink, can. But with this one, it's like even when it's not as focused when it has its hits.
Right.
So you end up with a lot of sort of artifacts on the track that you can hear, and like where the band's not landing on the one together at the same time.
Yeah.
It
was probably just one of those things that happens in the studio where stuff gets moved around.
We got it.
And like I don't know, like it's like it's so many things. Even where you place a drum kit in a room can change like the way that like everything else gets picked up. But for me, and I've said this before in a few other interviews, but Get It On to me is possibly the greatest sounding song I think that's ever been recorded.
Wow.
I don't know what it does to me. Maybe it's the perfect mixture of like the groove and the mix itself. But there's something about it, like even now, it sounds so fresh to me and exciting. And every time, not necessarily with my solo stuff, but when I'm doing stuff with like the band, I'll always keep coming back to that.
That's the AB.
And just be like, how can I grab a little bit of that magic, but it still sounds just so effortless, but yet.
Those downward flams is where it comes alive to me.
It's so
is
good.
where could you hear the ching 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 ching,
Yeah.
and you kind of, but then it's the cat, just the sound of the snare
Yeah.
coming down with like almost like the piano trill on it, and it's just like incredible. Well, we should do that one next, and then we can always go back
So this is the second UK chart topper, was retitled "Bang a Gong." with Get It On in parentheses for U.S. release to avoid confusion with the same titled song by the band Chase.
Which nobody knows today.
No, I never even heard of
Nobody
that.
knows the song.
It became their only U.S. top 10 hit. The backing vocals were provided by the Turtles' Howard Kalin and Mark Bolan
yep.
under their pseudonyms Flo and Eddie, with this swaggering toe tapper helping to further the T.Rex, which is Mark Bolan's version of Beatlemania, as it was called. We can only assume that similarly to the car metaphors we discussed earlier, Getting It On, banging a gong carry on the rock and roll tradition of being euphemisms for sex, which, by the way, rock and roll is as well. Yeah, dude. You said you were raised in a religious household, so without secular music.
Yeah, but it's a funny thing because my mum, when she was growing up, she was into Queen and she was into T.Rex, Gordon Lightfoot, ABBA.
So she heard the radio. It wasn't cut off.
And so was my dad. They loved all of that stuff, but it just wasn't really hanging around all that much, and I honestly feel so lucky to have sort of not had that, because when I was 15 and everyone around me was like Green Day, American Idiot and Blink-182 and all of this sort of stuff that I just couldn't connect with, which
the
was
Warped Tour,
which was so American to me, and I was just like, no, I don't really get it. And then hearing these songs and these artists, those are the ones where I was like, wow. Like, not only does it resonate for me, but it's also, I have a direct link to it. This is also my musical heritage in many ways, which is, I find really inspiring even till this day.
And that's a pride thing, which I think a lot of people, because, the Beatles, everybody was imitating, they were feeding us back black music.
Yeah.
Because we weren't hip enough to get it here.
Yeah.
And then it was like, even with the British stuff at the same time, I've remarked to him and to anybody that at that point in time that you were listening, and I don't want to say white music, black music, but because hip hop had become so hegemonic in music, these people in these short pants rock bands were trying to be as white as possible. Everyone went from, when you came up, you always wanted to have a little bit of soul. Freddie or anybody had a little bit of, but they were like, I just can't get out with, it's all downstroke. It's like their voice matches downstroke guitar. Yeah. They realize I'm never going to beat that. I'm never going to be as soulful or sexy.
Right.
So I'm going to go the other way and sing as nasal as I can. And I as a singer, I noticed, I was like, wow. Because even when swing music arbitrarily happened because black music became too good at it, and before Eminem, because until Eminem, white people couldn't figure out they had Vanilla Ice and they lost it. But it was that. Coming up, I can imagine what that must have sounded like to ears that heard this and the warmth and then heard this very sort of, it wasn't even angular, it was just like kind of tantrumic, angry white people. Like in crowds jumping up and down.
Yeah.
And I would have gone like, I'd probably listen to what you were listening to.
Yeah. There's, especially now, that there's so much at our fingertips, which is a real sort of like gift, and it's amazing, and I absolutely love it. I think, but with all of that like being said, it is sort of, it's really important to sort of stay true to yourself and love what you love, and when you can as well, sort of what I've always tried to do is, at least if I'm not gonna particularly be the biggest fan of something, I'm gonna at least sort of like really do some research and like think about, well, why is it that something's not connecting with me? But going back to everything we're speaking about now, it's like, you're right. Talk about soul. Like there's so much of that in this music, and just to sort of expand on what you said earlier in terms of, in many ways musically, like T.Rex or Mark, essentially the songwriter, is sort of very much imitating his like American black heroes, like the Stones were, like the Beatles did in their early days. But the funny thing is, like the Stones, for instance, it's like it's almost white kids plagiarizing it,
Yeah.
right? To the extent where Mick has like that
American accent.
Yeah, he has the American accent. The Beatles sort of had that. What's really different about Mark, and especially on the songs on this album, is, for instance, Cosmic Dancer. He doesn't say dancer. I was dancing when I. It's one of the first artists to really embrace like his sort of like UK like roots and his culture. And I think that also has something to do with when he was a younger man in the mod scene as well. And I think that sort of early 60s mod thing was one of the first sort of musical movements where they were saying to themselves, like, you know what, we're not going to look to the United States and we're not going to look to the blues and all these other artists like Howlin' Wolf, etc. in terms of what we're going to say. We're going to talk about our own struggles, and we're going to talk about the towns that we live in. We're going to name these places, you know. I mean, The Who being one of the absolute like leaders in
and then
that.
the Kinks getting left
Exactly.
in the American dust, and then his entire, his entire life of lyrics of that point are him literally naming.
Yeah.
He became a darling of British society because he was like, no, I'm good. I mean, we already did that blues thing. I'm going to literally sing about the, Preservation Society, and I'm going to sing about incredibly British things. And that's why the Kinks to this day are beloved in a way that almost none of the other bands are.
The Kinks, yeah.
Way none of the other bands are.
In England?
Because of visa issues and insulting.
Sure, I know that. I know the whole story with
right?
that. Yeah, of course.
We had
talked
Dave
about
Davis
it.
on.
Oh, okay.
And because of it, they never really got to break America till years later. They stayed insular and became like, well, we're not leaving you for America. So here's what we're giving you. And they gave the dedicated follower of fashion and everything that you hear about Blur, where you think Blur sounds too British, is direct lineage.
I've worked with I've had phases where I've really wanted to do something very English on a lot of albums that I've done, and working with American producers, that they call it fish and chip rock.
Right, which makes absolute sense.
Which I really loved that term. Butch Walker actually.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, he coined that phrase when I was working with him, but it's totally right. But I mean, again, going back to what makes Mark like so unique is he is using like musically the influences of his American heroes, but again, it's his choice of language which I think really sets him apart from everyone else. It's that mixture of his sort of Tolkien fascination, which a lot of bands had at the time. I mean, Zeppelin, Plant, they were all doing it at some point. But meeting that with this kind of like boogie woogie 12-bar kind of thing, it did create something really, really unique. And to be honest, those bands that followed after T.Rex, when he began to sort of gracefully, not so gracefully, sort of descend. He, they just couldn't touch on his originality, and it became sort of like a genre of music that the songwriters with their lab coats got into the studio and produced songs for like Sweet and Mud.
Yeah, we did a record with Mike Chapman, and he told us all the stories, and they were the best. But that's what the Chin and Chap, Chin and Chapman, they were all that stomp, all that Gary Glitter stomp, all the Sweet stomp, all this. I mean, Slade. It really all comes from kind of a wall of something, but a very concentrated effort to kind of do a T.Rex.
Yeah.
What is it? What is it that makes the audience? We Will Rock You in '77 is exactly like when you listen to that, you're kind of like, oh, it's communal stadium music.
Yeah.
You can't go wrong. You can't ask people to play polyrhythms with their hands.
Yeah.
You can ask anybody to stomp, clap, stomp, stomp, clap, and that's Get It On. That's Jeepster and all that.
And to circle back, go full circle moment. Ride a White Swan, which basically opened the door to everyone to T.Rex. again, it is just it's a simple gung, ga, gung,
Yeah.
ga, gung, ga, ga. And you watch all the old footage of when it went #1 in the UK. I believe it went #1.
Yeah,
I'm
that
pretty
was
sure it did.
that was the first. That was the kick the door open
Yeah.
moment, because Deborah and all those, they were bummed didn't find, and then Hot Love, I believe.
And then you see all of the kids, and it's one of the first like moments where the kids are all sort of actually like participating in the music, like and having their very own #1 record with their own,
It was generational.
new generational
Yeah, it was
god to
their
go with it.
new. It wasn't I'm at home with the Beatles and the Stones,
No.
as Bowie, cleverly sort of encapsulated.
Yeah.
It was, this is your generation's music, and from the 60s to the 70s. And if you were lucky enough to be in 71, 72, to be 8 years old or 9 years old up until teenager, this T.Rex was real. It's unbelievable in America because it's like hearing about like Five Star or somebody that never really broke here. I mean,
Right.
Spice Girls to a degree, but Spice Girls were huge. Imagine like the Spice Girls not breaking America,
Yeah.
and somebody trying to explain it to you. Well, it's like girl power, and they wear big shoes, and it's zigga zigga and they all, and one's a this, and one's called Scary, and one's called Posh. What's
Yeah,
Posh?
yeah.
Rich. There's somebody called Rich? No, it's like
Yeah.
she's like, that's a whole idea. And I don't think even in America, I mean, when Power Station in the 80s with Robert Palmer,
Yeah,
right
I saw
before
you
he
mention
broke
them,
again,
yeah.
when they did Get It On, it's like I think their first single was Some Like It Hot. It's to us, it was just sort of like a song we vaguely knew being redone in this with, the Chic drummer and like this, with this guys from Duran Duran. That was more important. But when you really, the way they did it with all this like weird technology,
Well,
they didn't realize in America, we heard it as like, that it was the Power Station song. Get it on, bang or gong. But I understand is what they were doing was a song from like, 15 years earlier. That was the biggest monumental hit from this band. And they're sort of feeding it back to us with, famous British people.
Sure.
So
Well,
yeah.
well, my question is because like obviously both of you guys, like I'm just becoming a fan. So then why isn't T.Rex in the discussion of like when we're talking about Americans saying, oh, the biggest British rock bands of all time? Why do you think T.Rex just never got?
I think it could be a combination of, well, it's the $1 million question. I personally think it's a combination of the short-lived, like, bright moment that he had, which a few other bands had also had. Like Slade, for instance, is probably one of the only other sort of like collectives like T.Rex in that time where it was just one #1 after the next
In England.
in the United
Yeah.
Kingdom, right?
Yeah.
And then I think what happens is when you have that sort of level of success and that pressure, you start to I think Mark may have like began to believe his own hype,
His ego.
and
grew out, yeah.
he was already one to sort of like spin a yarn and create almost like a fantasy sort of persona for like people around him and the public. And I think he may have just sort of like ran out of of kind of ideas just
Yeah.
at the opportune moment when he should have been breaking America, and it really stayed with him. And I think that was the most bittersweet pill he had to swallow was, David, the person that he, really kind of influenced sonically, was able to do that. And Mark was never able.
Yeah.
Even when he came back and cleaned up his act, and he had
a television show. If you want to know how
Yeah.
big this guy was? He had a show called Mark that Bowie ended up going on and doing it. And in the saddest and the most like metaphorical way, Mark slips off the stage
does
while
he?
they're playing together.
Oh, bless. I
And it
haven't
gets
seen
back
that.
on. Yeah, it's like, but it's one of those like if you wrote it, you'd go, oh, but what
Yeah.
about if he just like, what if his shoe, and he sort of slips out of frame and then gets back, but that it was, because what Mark did, Bowie was an incredibly adaptive chameleon, as we've talked about. He knew when to pivot, and he knew when to go like, oh, I also like And Mark very much took all the imagery and all that stuff and had, because it was a lot of it still had that boogie woogie thing. Once you've heard enough of it, it's like Gary Glitter. If I play you 3 Gary Glitter songs, I need never play you another Gary Glitter song before you go, I get it.
I think what's also interesting though is like we've seen this a lot. I mean, going back to a question that you asked me in terms of like, oh, you know, who's my band, the Struts, sort of like Beatles to the Stones, for instance. I think there's so much to do with timing as well. I mean, I think Mark, you know, was probably ahead of the curve of what the Americans were ready for. I mean, that's something that I've personally experienced when my band first broke essentially in the US was like 2016 and late 2015. Like one of our biggest songs was such an unexpected like success. And it was the worst time to be like in a rock band like in 2015.
Right.
Yeah, wow.
I mean, you would have listened to the alternate radio stations, which is where we were heavily like played on. There was no guitar music whatsoever, and we were sort of like waving this flag of consciously really wanting to bring back a real throwback, vintage like rock sound, and you know, we pushed for that, and our trajectory was looking really great and healthy. And then of course COVID happened. But I've also seen like other bands like, you know, Greta Van Fleet, for instance, and who we took out on their first tour ever.
You're kidding.
And they were out with us for months and months and months.
Wow.
And they just sort of really began. And you know, and for reasons that no one really knows, it's just some things like connect at the right moment. And I think someone like Mark was probably responsible in some ways, even if it was just one song or a whole bunch of interviews that he'd done for the US press, sort of just subtly people getting ready for someone like David Bowie.
As fast as we can do it, favorite song on the record?
My favorite song on Electric Warrior is Get It On.
Is there anything you skip over?
No.
No? Can you fuck to this?
Oh, absolutely.
What's your elevator pitch? How do you get somebody to listen to this that's never heard it? You basically already said it, but how do you sum it up in a sentence?
I would say if you're into mystical rock and roll with a filthy, bluesy, sexy rhythm to it, this is the album for you.
Dig it. Promote away everything you want to promote. Where you said the new record's coming out, or it just came out?
Yeah, I just released my first debut solo album entitled "Love Will Probably Kill Me Before Cigarettes and Wine." It's available to buy and stream everywhere at the moment. And my band, the Struts, we're about to embark on a 10-year anniversary tour celebrating our release of our debut album that came out 10 years ago. And we're going to be hitting all across the United States, and tickets are on sale at thestruts.com.
Now, do you play any solo stuff on a Struts tour, or are the guys sort of like, well?
I think for now we're just going to
because you have duets, Kesha and Joe Elliott. Yeah, you've worked with a lot of people.
All right, we got to get out of here. This has been so great. Thank you, brother.
Thanks for having me, man.
Thank you.
All right, so